Hello everybody, Jim here. Welcome back to another video here in my humble abode in Tokyo, Japan on another beautiful day. Today, got a video for you, kind of impromptu because recently, kind of like a marketing person from a company called KinHank reached out to me and asked me if I wanted one of these for review, the Super Console X. Which I didn't know what the hell this was when I got this email, so I went and looked up some reviews that were already on YouTube, some of them going a few years back actually, and I decided to say yes, I'll take one of these for review. I'm kind of weary about things like this, these kind of like, I'll just go ahead and say like knockoff consoles loaded up with a bunch of ROMs and emulators and stuff. This isn't the type of thing I usually would buy for myself. I do play on emulators. I play a lot of emulation these days, but usually it's just like straight from my PC. I have like Main and Duck Station and some other stuff loaded up on there. But this, it seemed okay. Like I looked at some reviews for it. The reviews were mostly positive, but then again, you never can tell when you're getting free stuff if everybody's being completely straight with you. So I said, yes, go ahead and send this to me. So if you don't know what this is, it's basically, and I actually have it here out of the box, this is it. It is like a tiny little emulation box. So there's a ton of emulators in here. The box says over 70 emulators. And it has something like 100,000 ROMs on it, which is a ridiculous number. There's no way in hell I'm ever going to play 100,000 different games, even though they're not all different games, and we'll get around to that as we look further into this thing. It's got a little SD card in it, and that's presumably where all the ROMs and stuff are, and then inside of it are various processors and things. I'm assuming there's like a little hard drive inside, and that's where all the emulators are. So when you start this thing up, it loads up all the emulators, and then you go to the main screen, kind of like the main HUD, where you can choose which console you want, and then that takes you in to selecting what game you want. There's a whole bunch of different consoles emulated on here. You got your 16-bit stuff, your 8-bit stuff. You've got like Commodore 64 and Amiga, ZX Spectrum, old stuff like that. Lots of arcade titles, so there's like CPS games. This thing runs like Final Burn Neo, various versions of MAME. So there's lots of arcade stuff. There's even PS1, N64, and Dreamcast emulators and ROMs on here. So it's loaded up with tons of stuff. Very easy to use. It came with an AC adapter, an HDMI cord, and then there's just a little button on the back you turn on. So it's literally just a plug and play console. It came with some other things too. So the AC adapter, HDMI cord, and it came with one of these, which I thought was pretty cool. This is a little like multi-tap USB thing, because some of these games, they support up to 4 players, arcade games, N64 games and stuff. So it came with that. That's pretty cool. It came with an instruction manual as well, because like I said, all the ROMs are loaded up on a little micro SD card in there, and you can actually take them off or add ROMs if you want to. Again, I said it comes with over 100,000 ROMs, so why would you ever want to add ROMs of your own? We'll get to that in just a minute, but it has an instruction manual telling you how to add ROMs to it, take ROMs on it, or even just like fresh, like reboot the whole system if you need to, which I haven't had to, thankfully. And it came with 2 of these, 2 USB controllers. And if you're saying to yourself, that looks like a cheap knockoff PS2 controller, you are correct. This is a cheap knockoff PS2 controller, and it feels like it's very light. The buttons are kind of stiff. It takes a couple of AAA batteries. It came with USB dongles, and there's 2 of these, like I said. And despite the fact that it is obviously very cheaply made controller, it actually functions pretty well. I played with this probably for a couple of hours just to test it out, put it through its paces, and it functioned well. Again, buttons kind of stiff. The sticks not quite so spectacular. So it's not exactly like the ideal way to play video games, but it works, I'll say that. It functioned correctly, which was surprising to me. Honestly, when I got this thing, seeing how cheap it was, I expected it to be like barely functional piece of crap, and I would have to sit here and make a review and be like, hey, here's a piece of shit. And it could have been like kind of more of a comical review. It actually functions rather well. So I played with this for a couple hours, but once I had enough of that, I switched over to the much better option. I've had this or some variation of this controller for a long time now. This is an 8-bit DOE. I believe it's called the Ultimate wired USB controller. This is much, much better. So I had a much better time playing with this, but the controller that it came with is actually quite functional. So that's everything. That's the console, the hookups, controllers, all that stuff. Now, we're gonna get into the games and what I found while testing this thing. So we're gonna jump over to some gameplay footage. So just keep in mind, everything you're gonna see coming up next, I actually recorded directly from the device through my AverMedia 4K capture card. So I'm gonna show you some gameplay footage. I'm gonna talk about what I found with this thing, what games worked, what games didn't, what glitches there were, what issues I ran into. So yeah, let's do that. Let's roll the gameplay footage. Okay, the KinHank Super Console X. Here we go. So first off, I'll say that just the interface was easy to use. So after it boots up, you have all of your consoles there, and you can just move between them and pick whichever one you want. And then when you go into the console itself, there's a list of all the games, which would be really arduous to get through if you just had to like scroll through them. So there is a nifty search feature, so you can just go to a specific letter, or you can search for specific words. And there's even other search filters, like when I went into the arcade games, I wanted either like some shoot 'em ups or some beat 'em ups, so you can actually just filter out the games by genre, and I did that a few times, and that was pretty useful too. So the overall like interface and everything, pretty clean, pretty easy to navigate. When you go to boot up games, you can swap back and forth between different emulators to run them on, which you will need to do for some of them, which I'll explain in a bit. And they're, when I first booted it up, by default, they're like bezels on. And the bezels were kind of irritating, but you can turn those off. So that's nice. And then you can play around with like aspect ratios and different visual options, so you can turn on and off like smoothing and scan lines. You can do various things. I just stuck with the default options, which I thought looked pretty good. Captured everything in 1080p 60 frames, and it all looked pretty nice, so I can at least say that much. It looked pretty good and sounded pretty good for the most part, but there were some issues. So I'll go over some of those issues now. First off, there is a PS1 section in here, which I was kind of like almost most excited for that, because I was like, cool, because there's like, I don't know, like 1,000 PS1 games in here, and I was looking forward to playing some that I haven't in a long time. But testing out the PS1 emulator, I realized like two big problems. One is that none of the games have their cinematics. They won't play them. So like, I loaded up Tekken 3, and the opening cinematic did not play. I loaded up Parasite Eve. I loaded up like a whole lot of different PS1 games. None of them had their cinematics. So that was lame. And then most of them did not have music either. No music at all. There were like the sound effects and you know, the voices, what have you, for the most part. But there was no music in most of them. And I didn't know what the hell that was about. I figure, because I tried all the different emulators, and it was the same issue. So it wasn't like a thing with emulators, it's the ROMs themselves. I have to assume that the ROMs are just not formatted correctly. I don't think they'd be missing the files for like their music and things. And I did look up some of this on like Google, just to see other people when they're using emulators, if they're having issues with PS1 games having no music, because I've never run into this issue before. I myself have used the PCSX emulator and DuckStation, and I've never had this particular issue. So it just seemed like they weren't formatted correctly, which sucks, because that means that I would have to then go in, like delete those files, like all those PS1 ROMs, and then go and download correctly formatted ROMs myself and load those onto the console, which is, you know, I can do that, but why do I want to do that? You know, if you're gonna buy this thing, I was gonna say I bought it, I didn't buy it, but if you were to buy this thing hoping to play all your favorite PS1 games and then you start playing Twisted Metal 2 and there's no music, you'd be really disappointed because it doesn't work as advertised. So that sucked. And then some of these PS1 ROMs were actually the Brazilian versions, so they were all in Brazilian. And I don't, or they were all in Portuguese, excuse me, and I don't speak a word of Portuguese. In particular, all of the Resident Evil games, all of them were the Brazilian versions, so they were all 100% in Portuguese. And like, I could play through Resident Evil 2 blindfolded probably, but still, if you were going to pick this up thinking you were going to get all these really great PS1 ROMs, just keep in mind, no cinematics, no music for most of the games, at least most of the ones I tested. And some of them are going to be in Portuguese, so you might want to brush up on your Portuguese. Also an N64 emulator in here, which I was also pretty hyped for. I was like, okay, cool, N64 games. I don't have like a ton of experience with N64, so I was looking forward to that. Most of them, like right off the bat, when it was just using the auto setting for the emulator, most of them worked. Some of them did not, though. So like when I tried to load up like Mario 64 and I think South Park Rally, some other games, they didn't come up right away. I had to toggle back and forth between a few of different emulators to get them to run. But when they do run, the N64 games I found ran surprisingly well. Like it's pretty good emulation here. So I was playing like Diddy Kong Racing, Earthworm Jim 64, some other games, I think South Park. So the N64 games work well enough. You just have to try out a few of the different emulators for some of the games. Some of them load up right away, some of them do not. So you have to play around with some of the emulators. Overall, though, once you get them to work, the games here actually look, sound, and play pretty good. There's also a Dreamcast emulator, which I thought was pretty awesome. I was looking forward to playing some Dreamcast games. And I can say that they play pretty good for the most part. There were some graphical glitches that I noticed. And that was like a little, okay. But again, it's like Dreamcast emulation. I didn't think it was going to be perfect. So there are some graphical glitches. But other than that, everything looked and played pretty good. The biggest issue, though, I went to load up Sonic Adventure 2. I was going to see how that ran on this thing. But then it turned out it was just the Sonic Adventure 2 demo. So you could only play the City Escape stage. So that's kind of... whoever was putting this thing together, I don't think they were really paying all that much attention to what they were doing with some of these ROMs. But the Dreamcast, for the most part, worked pretty good. Minor graphical issues aside. Arcade games. Okay. This was the thing I was actually most interested in trying out. Because I've been emulating arcade games at home for quite a while now, just on my PC. So using like different versions of MAME and Final Burn, like Final Burn Neo most recently. So I was looking forward to this. They have a whole bunch. They have a CPS 1 section, a CPS 2 section. They have one section just labeled arcade. They had a different section labeled Final Burn Neo, and a different section labeled MAME. And then there was also a Neo Geo section with the MVS games. So there are actually multiple sections here where they just have lots of arcade games. Most of the arcade games I loaded up worked perfectly fine. They played, looked, and sounded good. So I was playing stuff like Alien vs. Predator, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, a whole lot of shoot-'em-ups, stuff like Raiden and Truxton, the 1940s games, Dodon Pachi. I was playing a whole lot of those arcade games, The Simpsons, the X-Men, all that good stuff. Most of them worked perfectly well. Really no complaints there, but some of them, they would load up, but they were glitchy. Like the sound would be all busted up and it would run slow. And I would try like a few different, I tried all the emulators as a matter of fact, and it didn't fix it. So again, that would be something wrong with the ROM itself. And then some of them would not load up like at all. So I would try out all the different emulators. Most of them, by just switching over from like Final Burn Neo to like MAME 2016 or something, that would fix it, and the ROM would run on that. Some of them, though, like Killer Instinct, like there were a bunch of variants of Killer Instinct, none of them would run. So I could not play Killer Instinct at all. I think another one was like Smash TV. Like for whatever reason, I just couldn't get Smash TV to run at all. I think one of the games, it didn't run on like most of them. I had to switch to a specific emulator to get, I think, RoboCop 2 to run. But like a bunch of them wouldn't run it. You would just get this error screen saying it couldn't load up. So that's something that's, again, it's really not good. Most of the arcade games worked okay, but some of them were really glitchy, and then some of them just didn't work at all. And that's bad. And then that brings me to, they had a couple of other arcade emulators. They had one for the Atomus Wave and one for the Sega Naomi. So the Atomus Wave, I loaded up a couple of games with the Atomus Wave. I think the first one I loaded up was Fist of the North Star, and it played for like 10 minutes, and then the whole thing crashed. Not just the game, but like the console itself froze. So the Atomus Wave was like a no-go, and then the same thing with the Naomi. I loaded up Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on the Naomi, and same thing, it played okay for like 10 minutes. I got through like one fight, and then the whole console crashed, and that was that. And which is like crazy because it's a Naomi. Like the Dreamcast games at least run, they don't crash the console, and you can play Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on the Dreamcast emulator. But for some reason, the Naomi emulator, it ain't happening. So you'll get like 10 minutes out of a Atomus Wave or Naomi games on here, and they'll crash. So that is also shitty. Thank you. But I will say the SNES, the NES, the Genesis, the Sega CD, the 32X, the PC Engine, and the like Intellivision, the Atari consoles, all of them ran like pretty much perfectly with no issues. Never had any kind of graphical issues. No games fell to load up, and everything looked, sounded, and played pretty damn good. Which I guess is to be expected. I mean, I think the first time I emulated SNES games was like 20 years ago on like Z-SNES. I don't think they're terribly difficult games to emulate these days. So all of that stuff played well. It looks, sounds, and plays good. So anything, like if you were going to get this mainly for that, like you were like, I want all of the SNES and Super Famicom and NES and Genesis and Mega Drive and all that stuff, all the PC Engine games, or at least all the HuCard games. They only had 2 PC Engine CD games loaded on here for some odd reason, but they had the entire HuCard library. Or if you want like the entire library of like Intellivision and Atari 2600 games, like they're all on here and they all work just fine. And I tested out the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance also worked pretty much perfectly, and surprisingly enough, I tested out the DS. There's a DS emulator on here, and the DS also worked just fine. I found no issues with any of those consoles at all, so at least there's that. It runs those really well. So that was nice, getting to go back and play some SNES games I hadn't played in a long time, some Genesis games as well. Playing with the Sega CD games, playing some Sonic CD, and even going back to like playing like Night Trap. That was, fun because I hadn't played that in forever. And 32X games working fine, playing some Gex. And I played quite a bit of Knuckles Chaotix because I just wanted to test it out and see if it worked. But Knuckles Chaotix is like one of my favorite Sonic games, so I ended up playing it for quite a bit. So that's cool. So all that stuff works just fine. So if you wanted to get this thing primarily for that, then I think you'd be happy enough with that. There are a bunch of other emulators on here that everything seemed to work okay, but you can't really play them. You would have to, well, I guess I'd need to go maybe grab a keyboard or something and attach a keyboard to it. But stuff like for the Commodore 64, the Amiga, a bunch of the MSX games, like you would really need like a keyboard to play some of these. Like I was gonna play like the Commodore 64 Big Trouble in Little China game, but then I realized, oh yeah, that's actually a game you need a lot of commands on a keyboard for. So it didn't seem like the way you set up your controller when you first hook it up, and it's meant to play like SNES games and like arcade games and stuff, not like these Commodore 64 and like Amiga, text adventure games or whatever. So that's not really anything that I could really... I mean, it seemed like it ran okay. It's just I can't really play them. But then that kind of brings me to like another sort of issue is like, so some of the arcade games don't work properly. The PS1 games are busted with no sound and stuff. But you have all these, what seems to me to be like very like superfluous ROMs. Like a lot of the like stuff on like the Amiga has thousands of ROMs on it. The C64, thousands. All these, and most of them like I would never have any interest in playing anyway. There's like a lot of like really old, there's like old text adventures and like junky old games and stuff. I'm not particularly interested in those. It seems like if you were to like ditch, like, because that accounts for like, I want to say like 70% of all the ROMs loaded into this thing are all for like really old like PCs and stuff. I feel like if you would just like ditch all of that and just focus on like the main consoles, I think most people would want to play, which would be like SNES, Genesis, PS1, N64, Dreamcast, and all those arcade games. If you just, you know, focused on, you know, not getting busted, shitty, you know, incorrectly formatted ROMs, you could have something here. But yeah, I just felt like it was a little bit cluttered. Like it's one of those things that sells itself. Like it's got 100,000 ROMs. It's like, who cares? Why do you need 100,000 ROMs? I'm never gonna play all of those. How about you just have like 20,000 ROMs that actually like work correctly whenever you want to play them? That would be nice. So anyway, there's that. But something else that's kind of cool. Like some indie games they had on here that were released after some of the consoles were dead, like the Genesis and the SNES is pretty cool. And there was even like a Beats of Rage section where all these different like variants, like Beats of Rage, all this like little indie stuff that was made is there. So that's kind of cool. You can play around with some of that stuff. It's pretty fun. And then there are like hacks and ROM hacks and stuff. There's a whole section of nothing but SNES hacks and Genesis hacks, and that's pretty cool. And it does include some translated ROMs. So there are, you know, a whole bunch of games that were released only in Japan, were only ever made in Japanese, and then later they were fan translated, and those ROMs could be patched. So they have a bunch of those too in the hacked ROM section. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, overall, I would say this thing mostly, like for the most part, like 85% of the time, it worked correctly. It worked just fine. But that 15% is a big 15%. Again, the PS1 games with no cinematics and no music, that's just like unforgivable. It's PS1 music. It's awesome. And, you know, how are you going to really get into playing like Jackie Chan Stuntmaster if there's no music, damn you? So that's like a big deal. And then again, some of the arcade games not loading up, some of them being all glitchy and stuff. Those to me are big issues. So while I did enjoy actually like getting to play some of these arcade games and 16-bit games and stuff, that was all pretty cool. I can't ignore the fact that there are like some serious issues with this thing. And I even did, before making the review, I sent an email to the marketing person that I'd been in contact with, just letting her know like all of these issues I found. I'm like, okay, I can do a review of your product, but just to let you know, it's not going to be like a great review because I found all these issues with it. And she came back to me and she said, you know, I talked to some of the people and these are some potential fixes and stuff. You can switch the emulators, or you can do this or that. And I was like, okay, that's fine. That didn't really work for a lot of it. It worked for some of it, but not all of it. Still, I can't ignore the fact that the PS1 games are busted. And I told her, I was like, I think the ROMs are probably just, you know, incorrectly formatted. She's like, yeah, but you can just swap those out yourself. I'm like, yeah, but why then buy something like this? Why not just make your own little, you know, something you can put together at home? Why not just have emulators on your PC, or get a mini PC and just put all this stuff on there yourself? So yeah, overall, 85% I was satisfied with this thing. I did have fun with it. But yeah, it's definitely got its problems. But anyway, you've been looking at all this gameplay, so you can decide for yourself. But I'm going to throw back to live action Jim for some final words. Here we go. Alright, so there you go, everybody. It's a bunch of gameplay footage I captured from the KinHank Super Console X. And those are the issues I found with it. Some of them were pretty profound. The PS1 emulation was like the biggest disappointment once I started playing some games. And I was like, hey, where are the cutscenes? I loaded up Tekken 3 and there's no cool cutscene. There's no music. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? So that was disappointing. Loading up the Resident Evil games, and they're all in Portuguese, and I know the hell's that was kind of disappointing too. And then some of the arcade games not wanting to load up no matter what. Most of them I was able to get to play just by switching emulators, and that was fine. But some of them, just no luck. I couldn't get them to play Killer Instinct, for example. None of the versions of Killer Instinct would work. I think most of the versions of like Raiden Fighters and stuff wouldn't work either. So that was too bad. So here's the end of the video. This is supposed to be a review, and I guess ultimately the idea is, am I going to recommend this to my viewers? And it's super cheap. It's on AliExpress along with a whole bunch of other emulator things, emulator consoles just like it. And I did tell the people I would put a link in the description. I'm a man of my word, so there is a link in the description to their AliExpress where you can buy one of these if you want to. Can I recommend it though? Honestly, not really. I mean, look, the 16-bit stuff, all that, it works fine. Most of the arcade stuff works fine. If you're someone who has no interest in building your own like little emulation box, you know, a Raspberry Pi, or messing around with like Mr. FPGA, or even just buying like a little mini PC and just putting some emulators on it, just putting like MAME or Final Burn Neo or something. If you have no interest in building your own, this is convenient because all of the work has been done for you. It's got all the emulators in it, and you can add and remove ROMs at your leisure, which is all well and good. But if you're gonna buy this and just start, you know, downloading stuff, adding your own ROMs and altering it and everything, you might as well just build your own from scratch, because like I said, this thing has over 100,000 ROMs on it, and that's like 85% of the ROMs that are on here I would have no inclination to play. Don't really need them. The SNES, the Genesis, the NES, a lot of the arcade games, that's what I was really interested in playing. That's most of what I did with this. After I was done capturing the footage for this video, I kept playing for a little while, but all I did, I played through like Alien vs. Predator, Sunset Riders, played like Booger Man and Beavis and Butthead. I was playing like, you know, the kinds of games that I would play anyway if I had like my own emulators and ROMs that I was just building my own thing with. So I can only recommend this if you want all of the work done already for you. And it is super cheap. I looked on AliExpress, they marked this down like 70%. So it's like $30. So if you want one of these that when you get it right away, you can play some games and have some fun with it. But then know that ultimately, like if you were gonna get this thing for the PS1 emulator, you'd be pissed. You'd be really angry. You'd start playing and be like, where's the music? Where are the cutscenes? Why is it in Portuguese? That's not good. So I'm not gonna say it's like, I mean, you know, throw words around as false advertising or whatever, but yeah, that was like really disappointing. So I can't recommend this to anyone who has the ability or inclination to make their own little emulation box, or just run emulators on your PC and then just download the ROMs that you really want to play. You can go find like big ROM dumps, big packages of things where it's like every SNES game, every PS1 game. If you're gonna play PS1 games, like recently on my PC, I've been playing with Duck Station, and that's been great, but there's like PCSX, PCSX 2 for PS2 games now. Just, you know, you can go get a little mini PC and just load all that stuff on there. You don't really need this. So this, I can only recommend to people who don't know or don't want to know or don't care to know how to make their own emulation stuff at home. Then yeah, go ahead, drop 30 bucks, get this thing, get yourself, you know, a nice, decent USB controller, and then just, you know, play some arcade games or some Super Nintendo games or whatever, and you'll be fine with that. For everyone else though, if you can just make your own, do your, you know, download some emulators and ROMs, and just get your own stuff together, and you can probably do it all just for free, right? This is all like open source stuff on the internet. You don't have to actually pay anything. Really, you're just paying not for the ROMs and emulators and stuff, just the labor of someone else downloading and putting all that stuff together for you. So yeah, I can't really recommend this to most people, only to people that really have no interest in doing the work for this kind of thing themselves. For everybody else though, just go download some emulators and ROMs and have fun with that. So that is it. That's the KinHank Super Console X. I hope their their PR person is not too upset with me, or the marketing person, whoever it was that sent me those initial emails. But yeah, there you go. And let me know down in the comments, have you played this or any other? Because I know there are like a ton of devices just like this. Like I said, it's functional. It just runs MAME and Final Burn Neo and a bunch of other emulators and stuff that you can just go find all over the internet. They're very popular emulators. So it's mostly functional. Like I'd say, I was probably like 85% satisfied with it. It's just some of the bigger problems. You know, you can't ignore that. Anyway, yeah, let me know down in the comments, what are your experiences with you know, emulation boxes like this, good or bad? And do you yourself play on emulators, ROMs, whatever it is? I know that's becoming a much more popular thing these days, as collecting retro games, especially collecting stuff like Neo Geo and like real arcade hardware, stuff like that. That stuff is becoming just like prohibitively expensive. So ROMs can be your best friend, as is the case for me these days. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. This drug on for a little bit, but I appreciate you watching Mad Panic Gaming, and I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.